I wasn't supposed to touch my father's laptop, but that night I did, because according to his company's system, my father had been stealing money. The strange part? He was asleep when it happened, and every transaction happened at exactly 2:30 a.m., same time, same pattern, every single week. That's how I ended up uncovering something my father's entire company missed and nearly cost him his career. My name is Sophia. I was still in school when this happened, living in Hong Kong with my family. At the time, life felt normal, predictable even. My father worked in finance for an American company. He came home every evening tired but calm, always talking about numbers, reports, and systems I barely understood. I used to listen without thinking much of it, until the day everything changed, because suddenly, those same numbers he trusted started accusing him. It started quietly. He began coming home later than usual. At first, we ignored it. Finance jobs are unpredictable. Deadlines shift, systems break. But then something changed. He stopped talking at dinner. Not completely. Just enough for us to notice. Less explanation. Fewer words, more silence. And silence in our home always meant something was wrong. That night, I wasn't supposed to hear anything, but I did. My parents were speaking in the living room, voices low, careful. Then I heard my father say something that made me freeze. "There's money missing?" My mother reacted instantly. "Missing from where?" "Company accounts," he said, "and it's being logged under my credentials." There was a pause. Then he added something worse. "I didn't do it, but the system says I did." That sentence didn't make sense. And that's what scared me most, because my father doesn't make mistakes like that. Later that night, the house finally fell into silence. No voices, no movement, just the faint hum of a city that never really sleeps leaking through the windows. I should have been asleep, but I wasn't. Something kept me awake, not fear exactly, but that uncomfortable feeling when something logical refuses to make sense, like a puzzle that looks complete at first glance, until you notice one piece rotated slightly out of place, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. My father had fallen asleep on the couch. I could hear it, the slow, steady rhythm of breathing, mixed with the faint glow of the television still running in the background. The screen was too dim to show anything clearly now, just light spilling into the room like a fading signal. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal. And then I saw it. His laptop, open, right there on the table. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stared at it, because in that silence, it felt louder than anything else in the room. My first thought was simple. I shouldn't touch that. My second thought came immediately after. But if I don't, no one else will see what's wrong, because I kept thinking about what I had heard earlier. Money missing, transactions under his name, a system that insisted he was responsible, even when he said he wasn't. And the worst part was not the accusation itself. It was how precise it all looked. Too precise, like something designed to be unquestionable. I glanced toward the couch again. He hadn't moved, still asleep, still unaware of what was being said about him somewhere inside a system he trusted. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from something heavier, responsibility. Because if the system was wrong, and no one checked it, then the conclusion had already been written for him, and no one would question it twice, not for long. My hand moved before I fully decided. Quietly, I stepped forward and took the laptop. I carried the laptop into my room and sat on the floor with it in front of me. The room was completely silent now. Only the glow of the screen broke the darkness. Finance dashboards, transaction logs, access records. Rows of structured data filled the screen like a system that had nothing to hide. At first, I didn't even know where to begin, so I started with what made sense: time, date, amount, just patterns I could understand. I scrolled, once, then again. Nothing unusual appeared. Everything looked correct, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. because when something serious is wrong, it usually shows itself somewhere. But here, it didn't. I leaned closer, slower now, line by line, and that's when I saw it. At first, it didn't look important, just another entry. But my eyes stopped anyway, because the timestamp was identical. 2:30 a.m. I blinked, scrolled again, another entry, 2:30 a.m., and then another, same time, same minute, over and over. But what made it worse wasn't just the repetition, it was the pattern underneath it. Every 7 days, exactly 7, not 6, not 8, not random, 7. It was like something had been programmed to breathe on a schedule. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was coincidence, a system glitch, a formatting error, anything except what it looked like. But the longer I looked, the less human it felt, because people don't repeat themselves with that kind of precision. Even disciplined people drift, even systems shift slightly over time. But this didn't shift at all. It was exact, unnaturally exact. And somewhere between confusion and realization, I felt something colder settle in. Not fear yet, not fully, just the understanding that I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to understand this easily. I leaned closer to the screen. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing, just coincidence, systems, glitch, data repetition that meant nothing deeper than formatting or error. That would have been the comforting explanation. But the longer I stared at it, the less it held, because there was something I couldn't ignore anymore. If a person were manually doing this, logging in, executing transactions, there would be variation. Even careful people slip. Even precise routines shift slightly over time. But this didn't shift, not even once. And systems, machines, don't behave like people trying to behave consistently. They behave like instructions being followed exactly. That thought didn't arrive gently. It hit me in fragments. First, this isn't random. Then, this is structured. And finally, this is not being done by accident. My mind stopped for a second on that last part, because if it wasn't random, then it had to be something else. Automation. But the moment I thought that, a second question followed, immediately heavier than the first. Why would an automated process be running under my father's credentials? That didn't make sense. Unless someone wanted it to look like it was him. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the edge of the laptop, not because I was scared yet, but because the shape of the problem was changing, and I didn't know what it was turning into. I looked at the screen one last time. 2:30 a.m., 7-day intervals, exact repetition. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was starting to feel like something designed, carefully, deliberately. And I realized something I didn't want to admit. If I understood this correctly, then someone else already did too. I closed the laptop slowly, carefully, like disturbing it too much might make it real in a way I couldn't undo, and I placed it back exactly where it was. But even after I lay back down, my mind didn't stop replaying what I had seen. Because now, it wasn't just a question anymore. It was the beginning of a problem I couldn't unsee. The next day at school felt strange. Everything around me was normal voices in the hallway, lessons continuing, classmates talking about things that suddenly felt far away. But I wasn't really there. My mind kept drifting back to the same thing. 2:30 a.m., 7-day intervals, a pattern that shouldn't exist but did. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it stayed in the background of everything I did. Even simple things like writing in class felt disconnected, like my attention was split between two worlds, one in front of me and one I couldn't explain yet. During a break, I finally made a decision. I needed clarity. So I walked up to my IT teacher, but I didn't ask everything. Not yet, because I still wasn't sure how deep this went, or what the right question even was. I kept my voice steady. If a company system shows logins under someone's account, I asked. Can it also show where the login came from? Like the device or workstation? He paused for a moment, thinking, then nodded. Yes, he said. Most enterprise systems track device IDs, IP addresses, and sometimes even physical terminals. That sentence landed differently than I expected. Not loudly, but cleanly, like a missing piece snapping into place. So it wasn't just who logged in, it was where. That changed everything. I nodded quickly, trying not to show too much reaction. Thank you, I said, and I went back to class. But I wasn't really going back, because something had shifted now. Before, I only had a pattern. Now I had a direction. And once you know what to look for, you don't go back to not knowing. Not really. As I sat there pretending to focus on the lesson, one thought kept repeating quietly in my mind. If the system could track where the logins came from, then the truth was not just hidden. It was recorded. Somewhere. Waiting. That evening I waited before saying anything. Not because I didn't know what I had found, but because I knew what it meant, and I wasn't sure how he would hear it. When I finally spoke to my father, I didn't go straight to the point. I started small, careful. How late do you usually work? I asked, trying to sound normal. He didn't look up immediately. Usually 10 or 11, he said. Never later than that, unless something urgent comes up. I nodded slowly, but inside that answer mattered more than anything else he had said all week, because I already knew the missing piece. 2:30 a.m. That time didn't belong to him, not according to what he just said. I waited until the moment felt right. Then I said it, quietly. Some of the transactions were happening at 2:30 a.m. The shift was immediate, not loud, but visible. His eyes lifted from what he was doing, and for the first time I saw something change in his expression. Not anger, not confusion, something closer to disbelief trying to hold itself together. That's impossible, he said quickly, almost too quickly. I'm asleep at that time. I nodded once. I wasn't arguing. I was watching him, because this wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about the system saying something that didn't match his reality. That's why I think it might not be manual, I said carefully. That line changed the air in the room. He stopped completely now. What are you suggesting? He asked. This time his voice wasn't casual anymore. It was sharper, more focused, like he was trying to understand whether the ground beneath him was still stable. I hesitated, because once I said it, I couldn't take it back, and because part of me still didn't want to believe it fully. But I said it anyway. Automation or external access. The moment the words left my mouth, the silence that followed wasn't normal. It wasn't just quiet. It felt heavier, like the room itself had changed temperature. My father didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me for a long moment, not as a parent, but as someone trying to process a possibility that didn't belong in his reality. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the system under suspicion anymore. It was everything he thought he knew about it. I tried to explain it as clearly as I could, not because it was complicated, but because I needed him to understand exactly why I was saying it. Same timestamp, same repetition, same pattern repeating at intervals that didn't make sense for human behavior. Then I reached the part that mattered most, the part I hadn't been fully sure I should even say out loud. I paused before speaking, because once I said it, there was no going back to just observing, only acting. If the company monitors the system live at 2:30 a.m., I said carefully, while you are physically present, then they'll be able to see whether anything is actually happening without you. For a moment, there was nothing. No response, no interruption, just silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind that happens when a thought lands somewhere it wasn't supposed to. I watched his expression closely, and for the first time since this started, I saw something shift, not agreement, not rejection, something more uncertain, like the situation itself had suddenly become less stable than he had believed, because until that moment, there was still room for doubt, system error, misinterpretation, technical glitch. But what I had just suggested removed that comfort entirely. Now it wasn't about explaining the data anymore. It was about testing reality. And if the test proved what I suspected, then everything he believed about the system would have to be questioned. He didn't speak immediately. And in that pause, I realized how heavy the idea actually was, not just for me, but for him. Because once you involve a live test, you are no longer trying to understand the problem. You are confronting it directly. Finally, he exhaled slightly. Not a decision yet, but not denial either. Just the weight of considering something he hadn't wanted to face. And then, quietly, he nodded once. The next day he brought it to work, but I had no idea what it would trigger once they agreed to try it. My father brought the idea to his team first, then it escalated, up to management, then to the chief financial officer. And that's when the atmosphere changed, because ideas like this are never neutral in a corporate system. They either solve a problem or expose the person who raised it. At first, no one accepted it, not immediately. There were questions, some polite, some not. Questions about timing, about credibility, about whether this was actually evidence or just coincidence being interpreted as meaning. And then the conversation shifted in a direction no one wanted to say directly. Whether my father should even remain in his position while it was being checked. He told me later that those hours felt heavier than anything he had experienced at work. Not because he was accused directly, but because nothing had to be proven for doubt to start spreading. And doubt, once it starts in a system like that, doesn't stay contained. Eventually, the IT department agreed, not because they were convinced, but because they wanted certainty. A controlled, live test at exactly 2:30 a.m. That night felt different before anything even happened, like the building itself understood what kind of moment it was preparing for. My father was there, inside the office with the IT team, surrounded by monitors, tracking tools, and live logs that would capture every system movement in real time. Everything was set. Everything was waiting. And yet nothing was happening yet. Just time, moving too slowly. I wasn't there, but I could imagine it. The quiet tension in the room, people pretending to focus on screens while actually waiting for one moment. The kind of silence where no one speaks, because speaking would make the waiting more real. 2:25 a.m. Nothing. 2:28 a.m. Still nothing. 2:29 a.m. That last minute felt longer than the rest combined. Like the system itself was holding its breath, and then 2:30 a.m. it happened. A transaction appeared on the system, exactly as before. Same precision, same timing, but this time something was different, because my father wasn't logged in, and more importantly, he was physically there, observed, accounted for, not touching any system at all. For a few seconds, no one reacted, not immediately, because when something confirms what you didn't want to confirm, your brain takes a moment to catch up. Then the reality settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake in login tracking. It was happening independently of him, and in that moment, everything they thought they understood about the system began to collapse. Once the anomaly was confirmed, the investigation didn't slow down. It accelerated. Because now it wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about finding exactly how it was happening. The IT department began tracing everything backward, from the transaction itself, step by step. At first, the answer seemed simple, but it wasn't. The system log showed something unexpected. The transaction did not originate from my father's device. It came from a completely different workstation, inside the company. That alone changed the direction of the investigation, because it meant this was no longer an isolated account issue. It was internal. They narrowed it down further, and eventually they found the machine, a senior accounts officer's terminal. For a moment, that looked like the answer, but it wasn't, because when they dug deeper, they found something underneath the surface. A scheduled background script, quiet, invisible under normal monitoring, designed to execute transactions automatically. And worse, it wasn't just running the script, it was feeding it my father's credentials. But even that wasn't the end of it, because there were additional traces. Unauthorized external access, meaning someone wasn't just using the system internally. They were also accessing it from outside. At that point, the picture stopped being confusing and started becoming intentional. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't system failure. It wasn't coincidence layered on coincidence. It was engineered, step by step, layer by layer, to make one person look responsible for everything. My father. When the evidence was finally presented, there was no room left for interpretation. The responsible individual was confronted, and after a short silence, they admitted involvement, just like that. No dramatic confession, no resistance, just acceptance, once the system had already exposed everything. The case escalated immediately to authorities. Financial records were corrected, transactions were reversed, audits were reopened, and just like that, my father was cleared. But the relief didn't come instantly, because what lingered wasn't just the resolution. It was the realization of how fragile everything had been, how easily trust in a system can be redirected, and how long it can take before anyone notices. A week later, I was asked to come to my father's office. I didn't know why. I expected something small, a thank you, a brief acknowledgement, nothing more. But when I arrived, I was taken into a meeting room, not empty, not casual. There were senior staff there, watching, waiting, and I immediately felt something unusual. This wasn't informal. This was structured, intentional. The chief financial officer spoke first, and what he said caught me completely off guard. You initiated a forensic review process. I didn't know how to respond, because that wasn't how I saw it. I hadn't initiated anything. I had just noticed something that didn't fit. But in that moment, I realized something important. Adults don't always see actions the way they are intended. They see outcomes, systems, implications. While I had been focused on a pattern, they had been looking at the impact it created, and somewhere between those two perspectives, the same event had become something entirely different. A few weeks later, my father came home differently. I noticed it the moment he stepped through the door. Not exhaustion this time, not stress, something lighter. Like a weight he had been carrying for too long had finally been removed. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment before speaking. And when he finally did, there was something unusual in his voice. Relief, but also something I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Pride. They put your photo in the office, he said, a small smile forming as he looked at me. For a second, I didn't respond, because it didn't register immediately. My photo, I asked. He nodded, and I got a promotion. Silence followed, but this time, it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't uncertain, it was still, like everything that had happened was finally settling into place. I tried to process it, not just the promotion, not just the recognition, but everything that had led here. The late-night patterns, the 2:30 a.m. transactions, the investigation, the moment the system revealed what no one had seen before, and how easily it could have gone the other way. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had started as confusion had transformed into something neither of us fully understood at the beginning. Something that had begun with a pattern and ended with consequences neither of us could have predicted.